Welcome to Creamer Media's Polity. I'm Amy Witherden. With me in the studio I have Ebrahim Fakir of the Electoral Institute for the Sustainability of Democracy in Africa to talk about strike action and the tripartite alliance. Welcome, Ebrahim. With the ongoing public servant strike direly affecting South Africans due to stoppages in hospitals and schools, the government has come across as toothless in its ability to control the strikers. Why are striking essential workers allowed to stay off work even after Minister Richard Baloyi ordered them back to work?
Well, in the first instance, I suspect essential services workers aren't meant to be out on strike, and their strike is in fact ought not to be protected in terms of the labour law, because there is a essential services workers bargaining council to which they would take their wage disputes and everything else. But I think this is part of a broader trend in which you have a state which appears to be becoming increasingly more ineffective and appears to be also ceding its authority. And so politically, the ANC, the alliance, still would appear from the 2009 election, and I suspect the test will come again in the 2011 local government elections and elsewhere, appeared to enjoy high levels of political legitimacy. But I think increasingly it is becoming clear that the governance credibility that the ANC government is enjoying, as opposed to the ANC as a political party or social movement, but the ANC as a government, is enjoying less and less credibility. And I think key sectors of the alliance, such as the workers, are in fact demonstrating that this is the case. And the essential workers have actually, I think, by being as defiant as they are, demonstrated the point even further, that the state has not only ceded its authority, which I think is in fact quite a dangerous thing, where a state does not enforce the rules that it in fact can and legitimately should. So it ceded its authority. Beyond just simply ceding its authority, the fallback for governance is that its ability to actually enforce the rules that are established is becoming weaker, and secondly, that its enforcement ability and the coercion which is required in that enforcement ability is also receding. So this sends a message to a whole bunch of other sectors in society. Well, it appears as if the rules are not consistently and predictably enforced. The state's ability to do so, and therefore its authority, is receding. And it has ceded it in many instances. And if these essential services workers could have done so in such open defiance, why wouldn't other sectors? So it's not far off, I would assume, that corporates might decide, well, the rules aren't being enforced, the frameworks and the ability of the state to ensure this kind of oversight in enforcing the rules is not there. So why should we? And I think that's the dangerous signal this is sending, or this does send, with respect to two key areas of state performance and state capacity. And if the state can't enforce these, and at the same time it is those very people who constitute and make up the state who are in the streets, it's literally telling us a story about the fact that the state is becoming increasingly more absent, and government is becoming increasingly more absent in the everyday lives of South Africans.
But surely it's simple enough to make an example and arrest a few of these essential service strikers, or have they lost all credibility?
Well, I think that is possible, but I think there's something more subtle that's going on, and that's and that subtlety is essentially and quite squarely political. And I suspect what, in the broader view of some of the more conservative elements in the ANC is that they would in fact like to see COSATU being reduced to an economistic union, to being a union which is simply focused on shop floor issues, which is simply interested in wage negotiations, safety standards, enforcing worker rights, etc. Whereas in fact COSATU's tradition has been that of a social movement union, a union federation which is genuinely and quite heavily interested and invested in a whole range of broader socio-political and economic issues beyond simply issues of immediate concern to their workers. And I think they would like to narrow, there are some conservative players in the ANC who would like to narrow COSATU's focus so that it relaxes the kind of oversight tension that COSATU is in fact in the alliance exercising over the ANC. Even though this particular strike is about public sector employees asking for wages, higher wages, and better conditions of employment, and that is squarely a shop floor issue. It is squarely linked to issues of community concern, because the workers see themselves, and COSATU of course sees themselves firstly as members of the community before simply being workers. So the two are inextricably linked. Conservative elements in the ANC would like to see that split, would like to see that rendered asunder, would like to see COSATU being reduced to some kind of economistic union. And I think here what the strategy that may be at play is not to alienate many of the public sector workers too far, so that somewhere down the line they can actually get the public sector workers organized in ways outside of COSATU. And then it would leave COSATU or the Union Federation to organize workers which are largely located in the private sector, either in the mines and in other industry which is not owned by government, and in which government doesn't have control, and government is not the employer. And what would it then try and do is set up this grand divide, as it happened in Zambia and in Zimbabwe, between what the ruling party would set up as the liberators, as opposed to these narrow workerists who are in fact becoming conduits for outside agendas and outside interests, and are being counter-revolutionary. And these words are being bandied about all over. And so I think it is in the long term, or at least in the medium term, to set up this divide between members of the alliance, to push COSATU out the alliance, but to keep the public sector workers in. So it sets up this bulwark and this clash between the two. And that, of course, I think will simply become a ruse. And it's a ruse to the extent that those who are using the state as a site of accumulation for their own private interests, collusion with other private sector actors, to continue using, and the state's becoming a rentier, almost a rentier state where predatory interests have taken root and simply use it to continue their own accumulation path, and use liberation, use independence, use national sovereignty, use nationalism itself as a mask for this kind of recidivist behavior. And I suspect that what may in fact be going on as a strategy. It may not, I may be entirely misreading the situation, but that's what I suspect in the medium term is strategy that lies behind this.
So getting back to the alliance, many analysts think that government will give in to labour demands for 8.6% increase due to their track record in submitting to labour. What does this mean for the politics of the tripartite alliance?
Well, I'm not of the view that the government has always submitted to Labour. I think Labour has always shown that in the balance of forces between different constituents of the alliance, that in previous rounds of the negotiations, even though government held out for so long, the balance of power did lie with the people on the streets, with the workers on the streets, who in many cases had legitimate grievances, legitimate demands, and I suspect is true in this case too. So I'm not sure. I don't agree with the fact that government has always given in to Labour's demands. They have, of course, met some of them over the last 5-6 years in the successive negotiations, but this time I think that they have sent the signal that both sides have sent a signal that they're willing to wait this out to a degree. Look, eventually one of them is going to relent, and I suspect it is going to be government, because it simply cannot afford to let the situation continue unabated. But therein is, I think, it's a striking of the bargain with some of the public sector workers, and especially the essential workers, by suggesting, look, you were out on strike and you weren't sanctioned, you weren't disciplined, you weren't fired, and you weren't arrested either. So it's building a degree of sympathy, political legitimacy, some kind of credibility, so that there's some compatibility between a ruling section in government and these workers. And that, I suspect, will set up this huge clash that I was talking about. So the politics of the alliance are squarely mired in the entire strike, in the dynamics of the strike, but the dynamics are changing and changing fast. It is no longer a simple case of it's COSATU as a union, as a constituent of the alliance, simply going against a sector of the ANC. This entire strike, I think, has been broadly enmeshed within the ANC's own succession, within their own succession debates around 2012 and about the upcoming National General Council at the end of September. And I think this is a show of force by some constituents of the alliance about wanting to be hegemonic when the National General Council comes up, because they would want to be dominant in certain policy positions. They would want, and you can use just two as an example, the Media Appeals Tribunal and the whole debate about nationalization. So the strike is, I think, being used for multiple reasons. There are genuine wage concerns, there are genuine worker concerns, there are genuine negotiations going on, but it is also a show of force. It is also an attempt for one ideological section of the alliance, and itself is splintered, So it is some sections of COSATU which are driving part of the strike. Of course, they are unified on the wage demands, on their negotiations with government, but they are far from unified on taking positions on certain policy issues. And I think that this is an attempt to show force, both within COSATU itself and its constituents, as well as between COSATU and other elements of the alliance. So the strike, I think, is being used for multiple purposes and multiple reasons, and it's fracturing, I think, the alliance further than it ever has been. It's reached a stage where there's now open calls that the state has become predatory, that certain leaders are not just not credible, but also illegitimate. And this has happened on both sides. So it's very interesting, and I think this has split the alliance further, or at least caused divisions in the alliance further and more tense than there ever has been since 1994.
Thank you, Ebrahim. That was Ebrahim Fakir of the Electoral Institute for the Sustainability of Democracy in Africa.